We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I am very excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Sheilesha Willis. She is the Head of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at GEM. Sheilesha, thank you so much for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Absolutely. So thank you so much for the introduction and having me here. As mentioned, Sheilesha Willis, I lead diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging at GEM. She, her, hers are my pronouns. And when I was asked what I wanted to be back in the day, I would have said a doctor. I made doctor, but not MD, which was the original intent. And now it's just like PhD.
Very nice. Still a doctor. Very impressive. Fast forward to today. How has your personal journey really led you to be in the field of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and really being the head of that initiative at GEM?
Oh, I love this question. Well, my journey, I feel like this is one of those things where everything about my life experience led me here. And I can now look back and see that in terms of just like how I grew up and worlds that I felt like I straddled in a sense. Being African American, I grew up in a primarily kind of white community, but had family kind of everywhere and just navigating those different environments. And quite frankly, never really feeling a sense of belonging in any of them and not wanting people to feel that. But I entered school, wanted to be a clinical psychologist initially after getting past my MD days, recognized that that probably would be difficult. I wanted to be a child psychologist and got into IO psychology, which led me to getting my PhD in organizational behavior. And while I was there, I focused on and did my dissertation in diversity and leadership. And so I was really deep in the research. And this was a while ago, and there was a ton of research. And I recognized that a lot of companies were saying they cared about performance and the bottom line, and yet very few were actually focused on diversity and inclusion as a core strategy to that. And I could not wrap my head around it. And so I really wanted to bridge the gap between academia and industry and just be that bridge. And so I entered in to tech and really started my journey in HR and have been in various roles from tech to architecture and design, back to tech. So clearly I love it. And am now here at GEM, where I really get to apply diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging from the candidate experience down to our product, which is really, really exciting for me, where it really is like something that I get to do end to end across our business.
I love that. I appreciate you sharing both your kind of personal experience, your lived experience, and your why for doing this work as well, and bridging those two kind of industries or worlds and really making an impact in tech too. One of the things you brought up was that sense of belonging, and I definitely think companies are asking themselves and also leaders at a macro level too, how they can really create places where people feel like they can belong, communities as or employee communities as microcosms of society. What are the ways that companies can really, keep a pulse on how employees are feeling, and if that company is doing their part to ensure people can belong, knowing that people's feelings are going to consistently change, but understanding that it's a responsibility to create that environment.
Absolutely. Another great question. I think the first piece is to understand that our companies are like, we're in a relationship with our employees, right? And like you said, that relationship is going to change, it's going to shift, just like we expect the organization to. And it's important that we understand how our employee sentiment is shifting with the organization. And there's so many ways to do this. I think where some organizations just focus on the numbers and they're like, okay, do we have representation? Or we did an employee engagement survey and our one question on sense of belonging was pretty good. And that's where they stop. And usually there's a lot behind that. And so taking the time to actually talk to employees and candidates and people in general to understand kind of what their lived experience is, how they're feeling. I know we don't always like to talk about our feelings, but it's so critical to how we show up every day and whether or not we have well-being and a sense of belonging. And so creating that psychological safety, for one, to even get honest feedback from your employees, but taking the time to do things like interviews and focus groups across the employee life cycle to really understand what people's lived experience is and how it may differ by certain groups, and even more complex is intersectional groups, right? Sometimes we forget that. So that would be the main way, I would say.
Absolutely. So thinking about it from a holistic perspective, not just asking about this one time or during one-on-one too, and really taking the time to show up for your employees and for your teammates, demonstrate that you're actively listening. You also shared that at GEM, you get to work on the candidate experience, the product. You were just on a webinar with us, which was really great. And I want to ask a question around that data and insight-driven approach. How do you really leverage that data to support how biases can really impact those buckets of people, performance, product, and the employee experience? If you can give an example.
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, I will say like that was one of the things. I was a client of Jim's before I actually joined Jim. And one of the things I really enjoyed about the product was that we get to look at how bias might be showing up in the candidate experience. So one of the things that I've often seen, especially when companies are building diverse teams, is that they look at sourcing at top of the funnel. And they're like, okay, we need to source more underrepresented groups. And what they don't recognize sometimes is that it's that middle of the funnel where people are actually falling out, or underrepresented groups may be falling out, which is not resulting in a hire. So within GIM, one of the ways that we look at equity is we look at pass-through rates at the different hiring stages to understand which groups may be falling out at different stages. And then from there, I do a deeper dive into things like scorecards and candidate experience surveys to understand like what part of our process may not be as inclusive as we intend it to be. And that's obviously also how we encourage and empower our clients to use the analytics capabilities within GIM as well. But kind of taking that framework and applying it to different aspects of the employee lifecycle, like at perf, right? And in real time, like, are we looking at kind of our distributions and whether there's equitable distributions by group? And then in real time going, how do we disrupt that bias? How do we educate people and ensure that we have the same criteria with which we're evaluating people? So that's mainly the way that I look at it, but there are a lot of in-between metrics that I also look at to make sure that we're equitable across our processes.
Yeah, both qualitative and quantitative data there too. And, nothing is ever going to be perfect, but looking to see where you can iterate, really take that feedback and improve the experience consistently year over year as well. I think in order to get feedback, whether you are a candidate or employee, you need to really demonstrate and also create the baseline or foundation for psychological safety. Do I actually believe you're going to listen to me without retaliation or things of that nature as well. And you've also shared, and we believe this too at AllVoices, that psychological safety is built in those day-to-day moments from everyone across the board. Can you tell me a little bit more about this philosophy and what that really looks like for our listeners in practice?
Yes. Psychological safety is the underpinning of everything. I mean, think of Maslow's hierarchy. Safety is like the bottom, right? If you don't have safety, you don't have anything. So when we think about like belonging, we will never achieve belonging if we don't have safety within our organizations. And as you mentioned, a key piece of that is how we show up every day. So to me, psychological safety, well, there's an actual definition, but the way that it looks in practice is just micro moments, right? When you get into a meeting, do you take time to connect with people personally before you jump into what they need to deliver? That could be a one-on-one, that could be a staff meeting, right? Those are the moments where you start to build that psychological safety or that trust that will then lead to psychological safety, where people feel like when something's not quite going right, or they have a different opinion, that they can come forward with it. And so many organizations say they care about innovation, but we won't ever realize innovation if we don't have that psychological safety. And it really becomes like how you connect with different people. And I will say, in particular for managers, it's a lot easier for us to connect with people who are like us. It takes a lot more intentionality for us to connect with people who are not like us. And so, how do you create spaces where you ensure that you're building those connections with everyone on your team so that everyone is showing up as their best selves and has a psychological safety to put forward ideas that may be contrary to popular belief?
Absolutely. And I think that relationship is so important in terms of your teammates, your manager, leaders, who you see modeling that behavior as well. Innovation is a really good example of something that companies and people love to say is a value, but how are you really demonstrating that? What are some examples there? And another one is flexibility, or also diversity, equity, and inclusion too. And we know it's not Sheilesha's job to make sure that GEM is an equitable place to work. It's everybody's really responsibility, and that ownership mentality. How do you and your team really drive that accountability for everyone to really think about having that equity driven mindset and practice truly inclusive leadership?
Again, so many good questions. Where do we start? I think ownership is another one where I hear a lot of organizations go, we need everyone to be owners. You are the owner of X, Y, and Z. And I truly believe that we want to empower people to be owners, but it's not enough for us to just say it and empower people. Like, we have to give them the tools. So one of the things that I will say in my particular area is, I'm always like, I want everyone to feel empowered to disrupt bias in real time. And the feedback I often get is, how? And how do we do it in a way that people are going to receive it and not feel called out or get defensive? And so for me, empowering people to own means that you also have to enable. So you have to give people the tools, the training that they need to have the language to be able to disrupt bias and ensure equity, to be able to connect with people on a human level, because these conversations can get really emotional, and feel personal at times, right? When that's not the intent. So for me, it's really important for me to empower ownership through enablement and helping people understand how they can speak to other people, how they can call people in versus calling them out, so it can be received.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with that as well. I think it's similar to really saying, we really value equity at an organization, but then what is your strategy behind it? If you want everyone to be an owner, how are you enabling and empowering and educating and creating that psychologically safe space so people feel like they can own that as well? We've talked about this a little bit throughout the conversation, but I want to ask the direct question around that feedback piece of what role does employee feedback really play in the overall GEM company culture, especially as the team continues to grow and scale?
Yeah. Feedback is the underpinning of just who we are as a company. Honestly, one of the things that I really, really appreciate, and I heard loud and clear before I came in and I continue to see modeled, is that Jim cares about feedback. Before the product was ever built, the co-founder spent a lot of time gathering feedback. And one of our values is customer centricity, and everyone models that. And so for me, being on the people team, like, it's so important for us to gather feedback and then actually take action. It's not enough for us to just gather feedback. But what's nice from our product into our culture, even like our recruiting team provides feedback on what works for the product and what doesn't work, right? And then for the culture, we're looking at what we're hearing from ICs as well as from managers and people from underrepresented groups. And then I personally, as well as the rest of the people team, we partner with our functional leaders to build out action plans that say, like, these are the things that we actually need to improve, from a culture standpoint in terms of what we need to build on our teams. And we're thinking about, like, what gaps do we need to fill based on the feedback that we've gotten, or skills gaps that we've seen. And so feedback is really integrated into everything that we do, from the customer experience into our culture. And it's just like a fundamental piece of the way that the company was built. And so it really flows through everything.
I think that it is great that it's been a priority since the beginning, and it's something that leaders really care about as well and develop those action plans around too. I think that's a great way to demonstrate how you're listening to folks and really value feedback, and another way that you're going to get it again because you build that trust with people too, and that space for them to provide constructive, positive, negative, anything in between. You shared earlier in the candidate experience too, folks have an opportunity to share kind of their experience as well. I think consistently auditing the employee experience when someone gets here is really important too. This can be anything, but can you tell me about how you and the team have redesigned a system to be more equitable since the pandemic started, I think like 3 years ago at this point?
Oh, yeah. There's just been so much intentionality here, and I wish I could take credit, but it started way before I ever joined, which was one of the reasons that I did join. But there's a lot of intentionality that Jim takes around just promoting employee well-being. So one of those was wellness days. And so on the months that we don't have a holiday, we have a wellness day, right? So that people can really take that time to themselves. We have flexible time off where we really empower people to use it whenever they need it. No meeting Wednesdays, right? To ensure that people have really actually have focused time, because since the pandemic, we have moved to a Zoom culture, where that can be really exhausting over time, and just giving people the permission. I think the unsaids around giving people space and the flexibility, as you mentioned, to work based on whatever their needs are, like we need to make that explicit. We need to help people understand that they can take time for themselves, that we understand that life and work integrate in a way now that it never has before, and give them permission to just, again, own however they want to work. And so that's something that, again, has been really intentional in gyms since the pandemic and continues to be a priority, even 2 years in.
I think that's really important as well, making the implicit or unspoken explicit, writing it down, really restating them as well, rooting in values, and making sure that everybody is empowered to take the time that they need, use the resources available to them, and have those conversations with their team members and managers. I heard at a conference, I guess it's a couple months now ago, where folks were talking about creating a sense of belonging at their company. A great question that I do want to ask you too is, we talked about the pandemic, there's natural disasters happening, there's a lot happening in the world all the time. How is GEM trying to not perpetuate trauma that happens externally in the world, internally at the company?
Yeah. I mean, this goes back to developing a deep understanding of your employees. One of the ways that I will say that we're actively trying to ensure we don't perpetuate trauma is just through our language. So I recently have been doing inclusive language workshops and helping people understand kind of language that we use that either is oppressive or can evoke trauma, and understanding the ways in which our words can make people either feel included or excluded as a part of the organization. I think the second piece is really developing a deep understanding of different communities. Many organizations are well intended, but the leadership team just may not have as much exposure or a deep understanding of different communities. And so, for instance, our CEO is spending time with our ERGs to just do listening sessions where he's just listening, right? Like we do not need to take any action. I think developing that deep understanding is important to understand like the trauma that people have experienced, whether it's through, the events that you just talked about or the lived experience of being in systems that have been oppressive. And it can be hard to do that. And so having the courage to just sit and listen and not respond for a little bit, has gone a really long way. And that's one of the ways that we really try to ensure that we don't recreate these systems. We don't evoke trauma based on all the other things that are happening, but also create spaces for people to be able to come together as a community and speak openly about the things that they're experiencing. Because again, like I said, work and life integrate in a way that they never have before. And it's really important to me that we create that space for people to feel a sense of belonging, to build community, and to be able to have open and honest conversations.
Yeah, it's incredibly hard, but it is possible to ensure that we are thinking intentionally about how we're communicating. I think your example around inclusive language is really important too, because it can make people feel like they are included in an organization, but also on the flip side, excluded too, if you're not thinking about kind of how you're communicating a message, or not deeply understanding your employees as well by asking curiosity-based questions and being open-minded and having a growth mindset as well. Shalisha, is there anything that I didn't specifically ask you that you would like to share with folks who are listening, or underscore any kind of key takeaways you hope people really bring with them? I want to pass the mic back to you.
Oh, I appreciate that. I think there are two kind of pieces that I would challenge organizations to think about, especially as we think about psychological safety and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, is what are we doing on a regular basis to expand our networks, to expand the networks of our employees and get outside of our comfort zone? Because as long as we're sitting in our comfort zone, that's going to be a space where we're not growing and learning and innovating in the same way that we can. And so that's one thing I would challenge everyone to think about. And then secondarily, I mean, we've talked a lot about it, but I can't emphasize enough how important it is to empower everyone to use their voice as a way to create change in this area. One area that I think is not talked about as much as it should be is allyship. And each and every one of us can be an ally, and it doesn't matter what group we're part of. How do we use our privilege to stand beside underrepresented communities? And so, again, I want to empower organizations to really think more deeply about allyship and how we really promote it internally and externally, to really drive change in this area.
How are we using our privilege to really help folks who are not as privileged, and also from underrepresented historically communities as well? How are we creating that change as employers with more resources than other organizations or institutions in the country, in the world at large? I think those are good questions and big questions to ask ourselves too. Sheilesha, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon. It was really great to speak with you again.
Thank you for having me. So wonderful to be here.
Of course, and as a reminder for folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we really believe in employees and employers being seen, heard, and understood, and know it's a requirement for the business to really succeed overall. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.